The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient courtyard of Changdeok Palace in Seoul, South Korea. Kim Min-joon adjusted his crisp white dobok, the traditional Taekwondo uniform, as he walked through the palace gates. At 28 years old, he carried himself with the confidence that came from 15 years of dedicated martial arts training. The black belt around his waist wasn't just fabric and thread, it represented countless hours of practice, discipline, and an unwavering belief in his abilities. Min-joon had been invited to participate in a cultural demonstration for foreign dignitaries visiting the palace. As a fourth-degree black belt and instructor at one of Seoul's most prestigious Taekwondo academies, he was considered among the elite practitioners of Korea's national martial art. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, and today would be no different, or so he thought. The invitation had come through his master, Grand Master Park, who ran the academy where Min-joon taught. The Korean Cultural Heritage Administration wanted to showcase traditional Korean martial arts alongside historical demonstrations of palace life. It was an honor that Min-joon didn't take lightly. He had spent weeks preparing his routine, selecting techniques that would best represent the beauty, power, and precision of Taekwondo. As he entered the main courtyard, Min-joon noticed the elaborate setup. Traditional Korean musicians sat in one corner, their instruments gleaming in the morning light. Dancers in colorful hanbok dresses practiced their movements near the main pavilion. Palace guards in historical uniforms stood at attention, their presence adding authenticity to the cultural showcase. Min-joon's eyes were drawn to one guard in particular. The man stood perfectly still near the throne hall entrance, wearing the traditional uniform of a Joseon dynasty royal guard. Unlike the other performers who moved about preparing for the day's events, this guard remained motionless, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Something about his posture and bearing caught Min-joon's attention. There was a quality to his stillness that seemed different from mere ceremonial positioning. The guard appeared to be in his mid-30s, with a lean but solid build. His uniform was immaculate deep blue fabric with gold trim, a traditional cap, and white gloves that gripped a ceremonial spear. But it wasn't the clothing that impressed Min-joon, it was the man's presence. Even from a distance, there was an aura of quiet strength about him that made Min-joon curious. As the morning progressed, various performers took turns rehearsing their segments. The musicians played traditional melodies, the dancers moved through their choreographed routines, and calligraphy artists practiced their brush strokes. Min-joon watched it all with appreciation, but his attention kept returning to the motionless guard. When his turn came to rehearse, Min-joon moved to the center of the courtyard. He began with basic forms, flowing through the precise movements that had become second nature to him. His kicks were sharp and controlled, his stances solid and balanced. The gathered performers paused their own preparations to watch, impressed by the display of martial arts skill. Min-joon executed a series of high kicks, each one rising above head level with perfect form. His jumping techniques defied gravity, spinning through the air with grace and power. The demonstration built to a climax with board-breaking, thick wooden boards that splintered under the force of his strikes. The sound echoed through the courtyard, drawing appreciative murmurs from the audience. Throughout his entire rehearsal, the royal guard never moved. Not a twitch, not a glance in Min-joon's direction. The lack of reaction puzzled the Taekwondo master. Everyone else had shown at least some interest in his performance, but this guard seemed completely unaffected by the impressive display of martial arts skill. As the rehearsal concluded, Min-joon walked closer to where the guard stood. He wanted to get a better look at this man who seemed so unmoved by what others clearly found impressive. As he approached, he could see the guard's face more clearly. The man's expression was neutral, almost meditative. His breathing was so controlled it was barely noticeable, and his grip on the ceremonial spear was relaxed yet ready. "Impressive performance," came a voice from behind Min-joon. He turned to see one of the event coordinators, a middle-aged woman with a clipboard and a warm smile. "The dignitaries will be very pleased with your demonstration this afternoon." "Thank you," Min-joon replied, though his eyes drifted back to the guard. "That guard over there, he's very committed to his role. Hasn't moved an inch all morning." The coordinator followed his gaze and smiled. "Oh, you mean Guard Lee?" "Yes, he takes his duties very seriously. He's been with the palace for several years now. Very professional, very dedicated. Is he just for show, or does he have real training? Minjun asked, his competitive nature stirring. Something about the guard's composure intrigued him, but also challenged him in a way he couldn't quite explain. I'm not really sure about his background, the coordinator admitted. He doesn't talk much. Just does his job perfectly every day. As the coordinator moved on to check other arrangements, Minjun found himself studying the guard more intently. There was something about the man's stillness that didn't feel like mere ceremonial posturing. It reminded him of something his own master had taught him years ago, that true martial arts mastery often appeared as calm and stillness rather than flashy displays. The thought bothered Minjun more than he cared to admit. He had spent years perfecting his techniques, earning recognition and respect in the Taekwondo community. His demonstrations were powerful and impressive, designed to showcase the dynamic nature of Korean martial arts. Yet this guard's simple act of standing still somehow commanded more presence than Minjun's entire performance. As the morning wore on, foreign dignitaries began arriving at the palace. Minjun watched as cars pulled up to the main entrance, discharging diplomats, cultural attaches, and other important visitors. The formal program would begin soon, and he needed to prepare mentally for his performance. He retreated to a quiet corner of the courtyard to center himself through meditation, a practice his master had insisted upon for all serious martial artists. But, as he tried to clear his mind, he kept thinking about the motionless guard. There was something about the man that challenged everything Minjun thought he knew about presence and power. The official program began with a traditional welcome ceremony. Palace officials in historical dress greeted the foreign visitors, explaining the significance of the venue and the cultural demonstrations they would witness. Minjun waited his turn, going through his routine mentally, visualizing each technique and transition. When his segment was announced, Minjun stepped forward with confidence. The gathered dignitaries, ambassadors, cultural ministers, and other VIPs from various countries watched with interest as he was introduced as one of Korea's premier Taekwondo masters. He began his performance with the same forms he had rehearsed earlier, but now there was added intensity. The presence of an important audience energized him, and his techniques were sharper and more powerful than during the morning rehearsal. His kicks cut through the air with audible swooshes, his punches were crisp and precise, and his jumping techniques seemed to defy the laws of physics. The audience responded with appropriate appreciation, nodding and murmuring approval at particularly impressive moves. Minjun felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came from a well-executed performance. This was what he lived for, the moment when his years of training translated into a display that left people amazed and inspired. As he moved through the more advanced portions of his routine, Minjun's confidence grew. He added some spontaneous elements, techniques that weren't part of his planned demonstration but which he knew would impress the audience further. A spinning heel kick followed by an immediate jumping front kick, a series of hand techniques that flowed like a deadly dance. Each move was executed with precision and power. The climax of his performance was the board-breaking segment. Assistants brought out thick wooden boards, holding them steady as Minjun prepared for his strikes. The first board shattered under a simple punch, drawing appreciative gasps from the audience. The second fell to a side kick that seemed to generate tremendous force from nowhere. For the finale, Minjun had them stack 3 boards together. This was a demonstration of true power and technique. Breaking multiple boards required not just strength, but perfect form and timing. He took a moment to center himself, then launched into a jumping spinning kick that connected with the boards at the exact right angle and with devastating force. The crack of splintering wood echoed through the courtyard like a gunshot. Wood fragments scattered across the ground as the audience erupted in applause. Minjun landed gracefully, bowed deeply to the dignitaries, and basked in their enthusiastic response. It was then that he noticed the royal guard again. Throughout his entire performance, from the opening forms to the dramatic finale, the guard hadn't moved so much as a fraction of an inch. While everyone else had watched with interest, this man had maintained his position as if Minjun's impressive display was happening in another world entirely. The lack of reaction stung Minjun's pride more than he expected. He had just delivered one of his best performances, demonstrating techniques that few people in the world could execute with such skill and power. Yet this guard remained as unmoved as a statue, seemingly unimpressed by what others found remarkable. As the formal program continued with other cultural demonstrations, Min-jun found himself increasingly distracted by the guard's indifference. Part of him wanted to dismiss it as mere professionalism, the man was doing his job by maintaining his post. But another part of Min-jun sensed something deeper in that unwavering stillness. When the official program concluded and the dignitaries were led on a tour of the palace interior, Min-jun lingered in the courtyard. Most of the other performers were packing up their equipment and preparing to leave, but he felt drawn to approach the guard who had so thoroughly ignored his demonstration. Walking slowly across the courtyard, Min-jun studied the guard's posture and bearing. The man's stillness wasn't the rigid stiffness of someone forcing themselves to remain motionless. Instead, it seemed effortless and natural, like a tree rooted deeply in the earth. There was no tension visible in his shoulders, no strain in his neck, no sign that maintaining this position required any effort at all. As Min-jun drew closer, he could see more details of the guard's appearance. The man's face was serene, almost peaceful, with eyes that gazed forward without focusing on any particular point. His breathing was so subtle it was barely noticeable, and his grip on the ceremonial spear seemed both relaxed and ready simultaneously. Standing just a few feet away from the guard now, Min-jun felt something he rarely experienced: uncertainty. Throughout his martial arts career, he had encountered many different types of fighters and practitioners. He had sparred with Olympic champions, learned from legendary masters, and faced opponents who challenged him in various ways. But he had never encountered someone whose very presence seemed to radiate such quiet strength through apparent inaction. "Excuse me," Min-jun said quietly, not wanting to disturb the formal atmosphere but needing to make contact with this enigmatic figure. The guard's eyes shifted slightly to acknowledge Min-jun's presence, but he didn't turn his head or change his posture in any other way. "I'm Kim Min-jun," he continued, offering a respectful bow. "I performed the Taekwondo demonstration earlier." "I know who you are," the guard replied in a calm, measured voice. His tone wasn't unfriendly, but it carried an undertone of something that Min-jun couldn't quite identify. "I noticed you didn't seem particularly interested in the demonstration," Min-jun said, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the challenge he felt building inside him. "I was performing my duties," the guard answered simply. The response frustrated Min-jun because it was both perfectly reasonable and somehow inadequate. Yes, the guard was doing his job, but there had been something about his complete lack of reaction that felt like more than mere professionalism. It felt like dismissal. "Have you ever studied martial arts?" Min-jun asked, genuinely curious now. "Some," came the brief reply. The conversation seemed to be going nowhere, and Min-jun sensed that the guard wasn't inclined toward lengthy discussions. But something about the man's demeanor continued to intrigue and challenge him. There was a quality of presence that reminded him of the most accomplished masters he had encountered, yet this man was working as a ceremonial guard in a tourist attraction. As Min-jun stood there, trying to figure out how to proceed, he became aware of other people in the courtyard beginning to take notice of their interaction. The remaining performers and staff members were watching with curiosity, perhaps sensing some underlying tension in the conversation. The moment stretched on, with Min-jun feeling increasingly uncertain about how to engage with this unreadable man. Everything about the guard's bearing suggested depth and capability, yet he remained an enigma. The polite conversation had revealed nothing, and Min-jun found himself at an impasse. It was then that his competitive nature, the drive that had pushed him to excel in Taekwondo for so many years, began to take over. If words wouldn't bridge the gap between them, perhaps action would. Min-jun had spent his life proving himself through martial arts, and maybe that was what was needed here. "Would you be interested in a friendly demonstration?" Min-jun asked, his voice carrying a subtle challenge. "Master 2, practitioner?" For the first time since their conversation began, something flickered in the guard's eyes. It was brief and subtle, but Min-jun caught it, a spark of something that might have been amusement or interest. "What did you have in mind?" the guard asked, his voice still calm but with a new undertone that suggested he understood exactly what Min-jun was proposing. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with potential and possibility. Min-jun realized he was at a crossroads. He could back down, make some excuse, and walk away from this strange encounter. Or he could follow through on the challenge he was implicitly making, even though he wasn't entirely sure what he was getting himself into. Looking into the guard's steady gaze, Min-jun made his choice. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting different shadows across the palace courtyard as Min-jun stood facing the enigmatic guard. The other performers and staff members had begun to gather at a respectful distance, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Word seemed to have spread quickly among the remaining people in the palace grounds, and even some of the foreign dignitaries who hadn't yet departed had noticed the unusual situation developing. "I was thinking of a light sparring session," Min-jun said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty he felt inside. "Just to exchange techniques and learn from each other." The guard Lee, according to the coordinator, considered this for a long moment. His expression remained neutral, but Min-jun could sense a subtle shift in the man's energy. It was as if some internal decision was being made, though what that decision might be remained hidden. "Here?" Lee asked, gesturing slightly with his eyes toward the gathered crowd of onlookers. Min-jun realized that he hadn't thought this through completely. The formal ceremony was over, but they were still in the middle of a historic palace with foreign dignitaries present. A martial arts demonstration was one thing, but an impromptu sparring session between a Taekwondo master and a palace guard was something else entirely. "We could move to a more appropriate area," Min-jun suggested, though he wasn't sure where that might be. "The traditional training ground behind the main hall," Lee said quietly. "It's more private, and the surface is better for this type of activity." The fact that Lee knew about a training ground surprised Min-jun, but he nodded his agreement. As they began to move, the coordinator who had spoken to Min-jun earlier approached with a concerned expression. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, clearly worried about potential complications to what had been a successful cultural event. "Just a friendly exchange between martial artists," Min-jun assured her. "Nothing official or formal." Lee remained silent during this exchange, but when the coordinator looked to him for confirmation, he gave a slight nod that seemed to satisfy her concerns. Min-jun was beginning to understand that Lee's word carried weight among the palace staff, which only added to his curiosity about the man's background. The training ground behind the main hall was indeed more suitable for their purposes. It was a rectangular area with packed earth flooring, surrounded by traditional wooden structures that had clearly been designed for physical training. The space was empty except for a few pieces of traditional exercise equipment, wooden poles for conditioning, stone weights, and racks that might have held weapons in centuries past. As they entered the training area, Min-jun noticed that their small audience had followed at a discreet distance. The event coordinator was there, along with a few of the musicians and dancers who hadn't yet left the palace. Even two of the foreign dignitaries had lingered, apparently intrigued by this unexpected cultural exchange. "Traditional rules?" Lee asked as they faced each other in the center of the training ground. "Light contact, controlled techniques," Min-jun agreed, though he realized he didn't know what martial arts background Lee might have. "Just to exchange ideas and learn from each other." Lee nodded and began to remove his ceremonial guard jacket, revealing a simple white shirt underneath. His movements were economical and precise, without any wasted motion. As he folded the jacket carefully and placed it aside, Min-jun noticed the man's physique more clearly. Lee was lean but obviously strong, with the kind of practical muscle that came from functional training rather than gym workouts. Min-jun also made adjustments to his uniform, loosening his belt slightly and ensuring his dobok moved freely. As he prepared, he ran through mental scenarios of how this might unfold. Against an unknown opponent, the key was to start conservatively, assess their abilities and style, then adapt accordingly. They faced each other across the training ground and bowed formally, a gesture that felt natural despite the unusual circumstances. As they straightened, Min-jun fell into a standard Taekwondo fighting stance, weight balanced between both feet, hands up in a guard position, ready to attack or defend as needed. Lee's stance was subtly different. His feet were positioned more naturally, less rigid than the classical stances Min-jun was accustomed to seeing. His hands were relaxed at his sides, and his overall posture seemed almost casual. To Min-jun's trained eye, it looked like the man wasn't taking a fighting stance at all. For a moment, neither man moved. Min Jun waited to see what style Lee might employ, while Lee seemed content to stand relaxed and observe. The silence stretched out until Min Jun decided to take the initiative. He began with a simple technique, a straight punch aimed at chest level, thrown with moderate speed and power to test Lee's reflexes and defensive abilities. It was the kind of basic attack that would reveal a lot about an opponent's training and instincts. What happened next defied Min Jun's expectations completely. Lee didn't block the punch in any conventional sense. Instead, he seemed to shift slightly, almost imperceptibly, and Min Jun's punch passed harmlessly through empty air. It wasn't a dramatic dodge or a flashy evasion, just a subtle adjustment that made Min Jun's technique miss by mere inches. Min Jun immediately followed up with a front kick, thinking that Lee's evasion might have left him off balance or out of position. But, again, the kick found nothing but air. Lee had moved just enough to avoid the technique while maintaining his relaxed posture and balance. Growing more curious and slightly frustrated, Min Jun increased his tempo. He threw a combination of punches and kicks, each technique executed with precision and control but also with genuine intent to make contact. Lee's responses were consistently the same minimal movements that made each attack miss by the smallest possible margin. It was like trying to hit smoke. The more techniques Min Jun threw, the more amazed he became. Lee wasn't using any defensive tactics that Min Jun recognized from his years of martial arts training. There were no blocks, no parries, no aggressive counterattacks. Just impossibly precise movement that made every attack ineffective. After a few minutes of this one-sided exchange, Min Jun stepped back, breathing slightly harder than normal. Lee remained exactly as he had started, relaxed, balanced, and seemingly unaffected by the encounter. "Your turn," Min Jun said, genuinely curious to see what style of attack Lee might employ. Lee considered this for a moment, then stepped forward. His movement was unhurried and natural, without any of the dynamic tension that typically preceded an attack. Min Jun prepared for anything: a punch, a kick, a grappling attempt, or perhaps something from a martial art he wasn't familiar with. What came was a simple straight punch, thrown at moderate speed toward Min Jun's chest. It looked almost identical to the first technique Min Jun had used to test Lee. There was nothing flashy or complex about it, just a basic, straightforward punch. Min Jun moved to block it using a standard Taekwondo defensive technique. His block was textbook perfect, executed with proper timing and positioning to deflect the incoming strike. But, as his arm made contact with Lee's, something unexpected happened. The punch didn't stop or deflect as it should have. Instead, it seemed to flow around Min Jun's block like water flowing around a stone. By the time Min Jun realized what was happening, Lee's fist had gently touched his chest, not with enough force to cause any damage, but with unmistakable precision and control. Min Jun stared down at Lee's fist touching his chest, completely bewildered by what had just occurred. The technique had looked simple, almost basic, yet it had bypassed his defense as if it didn't exist. He had felt Lee's punch make contact with his blocking arm, but somehow it had continued through to its target anyway. "How did you do that?" Min Jun asked, stepping back and dropping his guard entirely. "Soft overcomes hard," Lee replied quietly. "Water overcomes stone." The words sounded like something from a martial arts philosophy text, but the practical demonstration had been unlike anything in Min Jun's experience. He had trained with masters of various styles, sparred with fighters from different backgrounds, and studied the theoretical principles of multiple martial arts. Yet he had never encountered anything quite like what Lee had just demonstrated. "What style is that?" Min Jun pressed, his curiosity now completely overwhelming his competitive pride. "Traditional methods," Lee answered, which was both accurate and utterly unhelpful. Min Jun realized that Lee wasn't going to provide detailed explanations, but the demonstration itself had been more educational than words could have been. Whatever Lee practiced, it operated on principles that were fundamentally different from the hard, linear techniques that formed the foundation of Taekwondo. "Could we try again?" Min Jun asked. "I'd like to understand better." Lee nodded and resumed his relaxed stance. This time, Min Jun approached the exchange differently. Instead of trying to score hits or test Lee's defenses, he focused on observation. He threw techniques slowly and deliberately, paying close attention to how Lee moved and responded. What he discovered was even more remarkable than the initial demonstration. Lee's movements weren't random or improvised, they followed clear patterns and principles. But those principles were based on concepts like yielding, redirecting, and minimal effort rather than the opposition and force that characterized most martial arts Minjun knew. When Minjun threw a punch, Lee didn't meet it with opposing force. Instead, he seemed to accept the incoming energy and redirect it harmlessly past his body. When Minjun kicked, Lee moved with the technique rather than against it, neutralizing its power through positioning and timing rather than blocking or deflection. It was like watching a masterclass in economy of motion. Every movement Lee made served multiple purposes: defense, positioning, and preparation for counterattack, all accomplished through single, simple actions. There was an elegance to it that made Minjun's own techniques feel crude and wasteful by comparison. As they continued their informal exchange, Minjun found himself learning more about martial arts in 15 minutes than he had in some formal training sessions that lasted hours. Lee's approach challenged every assumption Minjun had about fighting and self-defense, yet it was undeniably effective. The small audience watching from the edge of the training ground had grown completely silent. Even without understanding the technical details of what they were witnessing, they could sense that something extraordinary was taking place. The foreign dignitaries, in particular, seemed fascinated by this unexpected demonstration of traditional Korean martial arts that was unlike anything they had seen before. When they finally stepped apart, Minjun felt fundamentally changed by the experience. His perspective on martial arts, which he had thought was complete and mature, had been expanded in ways he was still trying to process. Lee had demonstrated that there were approaches to combat and self-defense that operated on entirely different principles from what he had spent his life mastering. "Where did you learn this?" Minjun asked, hoping for more insight into Lee's background. "Family tradition," Lee replied. "Methods passed down through generations." This answer was both enlightening and frustrating. It suggested that Lee's skills came from a lineage of traditional martial arts that had been preserved outside the formal schools and academies that Minjun was familiar with. Such family traditions existed throughout Asia, often maintaining techniques and principles that were considered lost or forgotten by mainstream martial arts. "Would you be willing to teach me some of these principles?" Minjun asked, surprising himself with the directness of his request. Lee studied him for a long moment, and Minjun could sense that some kind of evaluation was taking place. Finally, Lee spoke. "Why would you want to learn? You already have great skill in your own art." It was a fair question, and one that Minjun needed to consider carefully. His Taekwondo abilities were genuinely impressive, and he had achieved recognition and success through years of dedicated practice. Why would he want to start over with something completely different? "Because what you've shown me reveals gaps in my understanding," Minjun answered honestly. "I thought I knew what martial arts could be, but you've demonstrated possibilities I never considered." Lee nodded slowly, as if this answer had some significance. True learning requires emptying the cup before it can be filled again. Another philosophical statement, but Minjun was beginning to understand that Lee communicated as much through principle and metaphor as through direct explanation. The idea of emptying the cup, setting aside preconceptions and existing knowledge to make room for new understanding, resonated with him. "I'm willing to empty the cup," Minjun said seriously. "It would mean starting over," Lee warned. "Everything you think you know about fighting and martial arts would need to be questioned." The prospect was both terrifying and exciting. Minjun had spent 15 years building his martial arts identity around Taekwondo principles. To question those foundations would mean risking the confidence and skill he had worked so hard to develop. Yet the demonstration he had just witnessed suggested that there were levels of understanding he had never even imagined. "What would be the first step?" he asked. Lee glanced around the training ground, then at the audience that had been watching their exchange. "Not here, and not now. This kind of learning requires proper time and setting. Could we arrange to meet again?" "Tomorrow evening," Lee said after a moment's consideration. "There's a small training hall in Hongdae district. Traditional place, very private. If you're serious about learning, meet me there at 8 o'clock. He provided an address that Minjun memorized carefully. The location was in an older part of Seoul, away from the modern training facilities and commercial martial arts schools that Minjun usually frequented. As Lee began putting his ceremonial jacket back on, preparing to return to his duties, Minjun felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension about what he had committed to. The encounter had challenged everything he thought he understood about martial arts, and the prospect of learning Lee's methods both thrilled and intimidated him. "Should I bring anything specific?" Minjun asked. "Just an open mind," Lee replied. "And prepare to have your assumptions challenged." With that, Lee walked back toward the main palace buildings, resuming his role as a ceremonial guard. But, as he left, Minjun noticed something different in the man's bearing. The mysterious, unreadable quality was still there, but now there was also a sense of anticipation. It was subtle, but Minjun thought he detected a slight change in Lee's energy. As the crowd began to disperse and the afternoon wound down, Minjun found himself replaying the entire encounter in his mind. What had started as mild curiosity about an unresponsive guard had evolved into a profound challenge to his martial arts worldview. Lee's demonstration had revealed the existence of approaches to combat that operated on principles Minjun had never seriously considered. The coordinator approached him as he prepared to leave. "That was quite an exhibition," she said with a smile. "Very different from your formal demonstration earlier." Yes, Minjun agreed, though he wasn't sure how to explain what had actually taken place. "Very educational. Guard Lee certainly knows more than he lets on," she continued. "He's always been something of a mystery to the staff here." This comment reinforced Minjun's growing sense that Lee's position as a palace guard might not tell the full story of his background and abilities. The man clearly possessed knowledge and skills that went far beyond what would be required for ceremonial duties. As Minjun walked out of the palace grounds, his mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow evening's meeting. He had committed to exploring a completely different approach to martial arts, one that might require him to question and possibly abandon principles he had held for most of his adult life. The prospect was both exciting and daunting, but there was no doubt in his mind that he would keep the appointment. The brief encounter with Lee had opened a door to possibilities he had never imagined, and he was determined to walk through it, whatever the consequences might be. Minjun spent the next day in a state of restless anticipation. He tried to maintain his normal routine, teaching classes at his Taekwondo academy, practicing his own forms, handling administrative duties, but his mind kept returning to the mysterious encounter with Lee at the palace. Every technique he performed felt different now, filtered through questions that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. During his advanced class that afternoon, Minjun found himself observing his students with new eyes. These were accomplished martial artists, many of them black belts with years of training. They executed their techniques with precision and power, demonstrating the skills that had made Taekwondo famous worldwide. Yet as Minjun watched them spar, he kept thinking about Lee's effortless movements and the way hard technique had simply flowed around his defenses. "Master Kim, you seem distracted today," observed young Soo-jin, one of his most senior students. She was a third-degree black belt who competed internationally and had trained under Minjun for 5 years. "Just processing some new ideas about martial arts," Minjun replied, which was true enough. "Anything you'd like to share with the class?" Minjun considered this question seriously. How could he explain an encounter that had challenged his fundamental understanding of fighting without undermining his students' confidence in their training? The principles Lee had demonstrated seemed to contradict many of the basic concepts that formed the foundation of Taekwondo. "Sometimes we discover that there are different approaches to the same goals," he said carefully. "What matters is keeping an open mind and being willing to learn." After class ended and his students had departed, Minjun spent time alone in the training hall, working through his forms and trying to apply some of the concepts he had observed in Lee's movements. The results were frustrating and illuminating in equal measure. When he tried to incorporate the yielding, flowing principles into his own techniques, they felt awkward and ineffective. Yet he couldn't shake the memory of how naturally and powerfully those same principles had worked for Lee. As evening approached, Minjun made his way across Seoul to the address Lee had provided. The Hongdae district was known for its vibrant nightlife and artistic community, but the location Lee had specified was away from the main entertainment areas. Min-jun found himself walking through quiet residential streets lined with traditional Korean houses and small businesses that had been serving the neighborhood for generations. The training hall was tucked away on a side street, marked only by a small wooden sign with characters that read Traditional Methods Training. The building itself looked ancient, with weathered wood and traditional tile roofing that suggested it had been standing for decades if not longer. There were no flashy signs or modern decorations, just an understated entrance that someone could easily walk past without noticing. Min-jun knocked softly on the heavy wooden door, uncertain what to expect. After a moment, it opened to reveal Lee, no longer in his palace guard uniform but wearing simple black training clothes that looked both practical and traditional. The man's bearing remained the same, quiet, centered, and somehow larger than his physical presence suggested. "You came," Lee said, and Min-jun detected something that might have been approval in his voice. "I said I would." Lee stepped aside to allow Min-jun to enter, and what he saw inside took his breath away. The training hall was unlike any martial arts facility he had ever encountered. The floor was polished hardwood, worn smooth by generations of practitioners. The walls were lined with traditional weapons, swords, spears, and implements Min-jun didn't recognize, all clearly functional rather than decorative. Calligraphy scrolls hung at strategic points, though the characters were too stylized for Min-jun to read in the dim lighting. But what struck him most was the atmosphere. There was a weight to the space, a sense of history and accumulated knowledge that made even breathing feel significant. This wasn't a commercial training facility or a modern dojo. This was a place where serious martial arts had been practiced for a very long time. "Welcome to our family's training hall," Lee said quietly. "It's been in continuous use for over 200 years. Min-jun felt a profound sense of privilege at being invited into such a space. Family training halls were rare and precious, usually closed to outsiders and passed down through bloodlines with their associated knowledge and techniques. For Lee to bring him here suggested a level of trust that Min-jun hoped he could prove worthy of. "Are there other students?" Min-jun asked, noticing that they appeared to be alone. "Not at the moment," Lee replied. "Our methods are not suited to large groups or casual study. We work with individuals who demonstrate both ability and proper character." This answer both honored and intimidated Min-jun. He was being offered access to knowledge that few people would ever encounter, but the responsibility that came with such an opportunity weighed heavily on him. "Before we begin," Lee continued, "you need to understand what you're asking for. The methods my family preserves are complete systems, not techniques to be added to what you already know. Learning them properly requires setting aside other approaches, at least initially." "I understand," Min-jun said, though he wasn't entirely sure he did. "Do you? You spent 15 years mastering Taekwondo. You're recognized as an expert, you teach others, and your identity is built around those accomplishments. What I'm offering would require you to become a beginner again." The challenge in Lee's words was clear, and Min-jun took time to consider his response carefully. Everything Lee said was true. Taekwondo had given him not just physical skills but social status, professional opportunities, and a sense of personal identity. To set all that aside, even temporarily, would be like abandoning a part of himself. "Yesterday, you made my techniques look childish," Min-jun said finally. "You demonstrated possibilities I never imagined. If becoming a beginner again is the price for understanding those possibilities, then I'm willing to pay it." Lee studied him for a long moment, and Min-jun had the sense that this entire conversation was some kind of test. Finally, Lee nodded. "Then, we begin with the most fundamental principle," he said. "Everything you think you know about fighting is wrong." The statement hung in the air between them, absolute and challenging. Min-jun felt a moment of defensive anger. His Taekwondo skills were real and effective, earned through years of dedicated practice. But he forced himself to set aside that reaction and listen. "Fighting is not about imposing your will on an opponent," Lee continued. "It's about harmony. Not harmony in the sense of peace, but harmony in the sense of moving with natural forces rather than against them." Lee gestured for Min-jun to take a position in the center of the training hall. "Show me your strongest technique," he said. The one you're most confident in. Min Jun chose a jumping spinning heel kick, one of Taekwondo's most spectacular techniques and one he had spent years perfecting. He set himself, gathered his energy, and launched into the complex movement. His execution was flawless. He rose high into the air, spun with perfect control, and extended his leg in a kick that would have devastated any target it connected with. Impressive, Lee acknowledged as Min Jun landed. Now tell me, what happens if your opponent moves? The question seemed almost insultingly simple. I adjust and attack again, Min Jun replied. Show me. Lee positioned himself as if he were the target of Min Jun's kick, then simply stepped to one side as Min Jun began his technique. The movement was minimal, barely more than a shuffle, but it completely negated the spectacular kick. Min Jun found himself landing off balance, having committed all his energy to an attack that hit nothing but air. Try to adjust and attack again, Lee suggested. Min Jun attempted to follow up with a rapid combination of punches and kicks, but Lee's movement had left him out of position and slightly off balance. His follow-up techniques were rushed and imprecise, nowhere near his normal standard. The more complex and committed your attack, Lee explained, the more vulnerable you become when it fails. You put all your energy into creating power, but power without connection is meaningless. Lee demonstrated his point by executing what appeared to be the same jumping spinning heel kick that Min Jun had performed. But, even though the movements looked similar, there was something fundamentally different about Lee's execution. Where Min Jun had committed fully to the technique, Lee seemed to maintain options throughout the movement. When Lee landed, he was perfectly balanced and ready for whatever might come next. The difference is intention, Lee explained. You performed your technique to generate maximum power. I performed mine to maintain maximum adaptability. Min Jun was beginning to understand that the gap between his approach and Lee's was wider than he had initially realized. It wasn't just a matter of different techniques or strategies. It was a completely different philosophy about what martial arts were supposed to accomplish. In traditional methods, Lee continued, we don't fight against our opponents. We join with them. I don't understand what that means. When someone attacks you, they're creating energy and momentum. Instead of meeting that energy with opposing force, we learn to redirect it and use it for our own purposes. Lee positioned himself in front of Min Jun and nodded toward him. Punch me, he said simply. Min Jun threw a straight punch at moderate speed, curious to see how Lee would demonstrate this principle of joining and redirecting. What happened was even more subtle than their encounter at the palace. Lee didn't block or deflect the punch in any visible way. Instead, he seemed to move slightly forward and to the side, accepting the incoming energy while simultaneously redirecting it. The result was that Min Jun's punch not only missed but actually pulled him off balance in the direction Lee had moved. Before Min Jun realized what was happening, Lee had gently placed a hand on his back and guided him past his original position. Your energy, redirected, Lee explained as Min Jun stumbled slightly and turned around. I didn't fight against your attack. I joined with it and gave it a new direction. But how do you know which direction to move? The attack tells you. Every technique has natural weak points, natural directions where the energy wants to flow. We learn to read those patterns and work with them rather than against them. For the next hour, Lee demonstrated various applications of this principle. He showed how different attacks created different energy patterns, and how those patterns could be redirected in ways that turned an opponent's strength into weakness. It was like watching a master chess player who could see several moves ahead, except that the game was being played with bodies in motion rather than pieces on a board. What amazed Min Jun most was the effortless nature of Lee's techniques. Where Taekwondo emphasized explosive power and dynamic movement, Lee's methods seemed to accomplish more with less. There was no wasted motion, no excess tension, no dramatic displays of strength. Just precise, economical movement that consistently achieved its objectives. This is just the beginning, Lee said as they took a brief rest. What I've shown you tonight are basic principles. Developing the sensitivity to apply them naturally takes time and practice. How much time? Lee smiled slightly, the first clear expression of emotion Min Jun had seen from him. Traditional methods are measured in decades, not months or years. My own training began when I was 7 years old. The timeline was sobering. Min Jun had achieved his Taekwondo black belt in 5 years, which was considered quite good. The idea that meaningful proficiency in Lee's methods might require decades of study was both intimidating and intriguing. Would you be willing to start me on that path? Min Jun asked. That depends on you, Lee replied. True learning requires more than enthusiasm. It requires humility, patience, and the willingness to be wrong about things you're certain you understand. As if to illustrate this point, Lee had Min Jun attempt to apply the principles they had just practiced. The results were predictably clumsy. Min Jun's attempts to redirect energy instead of opposing it felt awkward and ineffective. His timing was wrong, his positioning was imprecise, and his understanding of the energy patterns was superficial at best. But, rather than becoming frustrated, Min Jun found himself energized by the challenge. After years of martial arts practice, he was encountering something genuinely new and difficult. The learning curve was steep, but that only made the prospect more appealing. I want to learn, he said firmly. Whatever it takes. Lee nodded slowly. Then, we'll begin properly next week. But, understand that this commitment will change how you think about everything you've learned before. Change how? Right now, you believe that martial arts are about becoming stronger, faster, more skilled than your opponents. Traditional methods teach that martial arts are about becoming more yourself, more centered, more aware, more in harmony with the natural world. The distinction was subtle but profound. Min Jun had indeed approached Taekwondo as a way of developing superior fighting ability. The idea that martial arts could be a path to something deeper than combat effectiveness was intellectually appealing, though he wasn't sure he understood what it meant in practical terms. Will I still be able to teach Taekwondo while learning your methods? For now, Lee said. But, eventually you may find that the two approaches conflict in ways that require choices. It was an ominous warning, but one that Min Jun felt prepared to face when the time came. The encounter with Lee had already begun changing how he thought about martial arts. The prospect of deeper changes felt like a natural evolution rather than a threat. As their session concluded and Min Jun prepared to leave, Lee provided him with specific exercises to practice during the coming week. They were simple movements, basic stepping patterns, and breathing exercises that looked nothing like martial arts techniques. But Lee insisted that these fundamentals were essential preparation for more advanced training. Don't practice these movements to get good at them, Lee instructed. Practice them to understand the principles they contain. Walking back through the quiet streets of Hongdae, Min Jun felt like he was returning from another world. The traditional training hall and its ancient methods seemed removed from the modern city around him, connected to a deeper and older understanding of what martial arts could be. The encounter had raised as many questions as it had answered, but Min Jun found that he was comfortable with uncertainty in a way that would have frustrated him before. He was embarking on a journey whose destination was unclear, but the quality of his guide gave him confidence that the path would be worthwhile. As he reached his apartment and prepared for sleep, Min Jun realized that his life had just taken a significant turn. The man who had walked into Changdeok Palace yesterday morning had been confident in his martial arts knowledge and secure in his identity as a Taekwondo master. The man going to bed tonight was still all of those things, but he was also something else, a beginner again, ready to discover what lay beyond everything he thought he knew. 3 months later, Min Jun stood in his familiar Taekwondo academy, watching his advanced students practice the same forms he had been teaching for years. But everything looked different now. Where he once saw precision and power, he now noticed tension and wasted energy. Where he had previously admired dynamic techniques, he now observed how those same movements left practitioners vulnerable and off balance. The transformation in his perspective had been gradual but profound. Under Lee's careful guidance, Min Jun had begun to understand martial arts principles that operated on completely different assumptions than those underlying Taekwondo. The weekly sessions at the traditional training hall had become the most important part of his life, even as they systematically challenged everything he had believed about fighting and self-defense. Master Kim called young Soo-jin, the same senior student who had noticed his distraction months earlier. Could you demonstrate the advanced kick sequence for the newer students? Min-jun nodded and moved to the center of the training floor. He had performed this particular sequence hundreds of times over the years, and his muscle memory guided him through the complex combination of jumping kicks, spinning techniques, and dramatic finishing moves. To the watching students, his execution looked as flawless as ever: precise timing, perfect balance, and impressive physical ability. But, as Min-jun performed the sequence, he was acutely aware of aspects that had been invisible to him before his training with Lee. He felt the moments where his commitment to powerful techniques left him unable to adapt to changing circumstances. He noticed how the dramatic movements that looked so impressive actually telegraphed his intentions and created predictable patterns that a skilled opponent could exploit. Most significantly, he experienced a growing sense that he was performing movements that belonged to someone else, techniques designed by other people based on their understanding of combat, rather than expressing his own natural way of moving and responding to threats. "Excellent as always, Master," said Sujin after he completed the demonstration. "Those kicks still look impossible to me." "Impossibility is often just a failure of imagination," Min-jun replied, unconsciously echoing something Lee had told him weeks earlier. The comment seemed to confuse Sujin slightly, but she nodded respectfully and returned to practice. Min-jun realized that he was beginning to speak in the same philosophical manner that had initially frustrated him about Lee. The deeper principles underlying traditional methods seemed to resist direct explanation, revealing themselves more naturally through metaphor and paradox. That evening, Min-jun made his usual journey to the traditional training hall in Hongdae. The weekly sessions had evolved significantly since his first tentative introduction to Lee's methods. What had begun as basic exercises in redirecting energy had progressed to more complex applications involving multiple attackers, weapons, and scenarios that tested his developing understanding of traditional principles. Lee was already waiting when Min-jun arrived, as he always was. The man's punctuality was absolute, and Min-jun had learned that this reflected not just courtesy but a fundamental aspect of how traditional methods approach training. Everything was done with complete attention and commitment, no matter how simple or basic it might appear. "How was your week of practice?" Lee asked as they began their usual warm-up routine. "Challenging," Min-jun replied honestly. "I'm starting to see the limitations in my Taekwondo training, but I'm not yet skilled enough in traditional methods to replace what I'm losing." It was a frustrating period in his development. As his understanding of traditional principles deepened, his confidence in his previous martial arts abilities had begun to erode. Yet his skill in applying Lee's methods was still rudimentary, leaving him feeling caught between two different approaches without mastery of either. "That frustration is necessary," Lee said calmly. "You're discovering that true knowledge means understanding the boundaries of what you know, not just accumulating techniques." They began their training session with the breathing and movement exercises that formed the foundation of traditional methods. To an outside observer, these would have looked like slow, simple calisthenics. But Min-jun had learned that each movement contained multiple layers of meaning and application that revealed themselves gradually through patient practice. The breathing patterns, in particular, had proven to be more complex than they initially appeared. Lee had explained that proper breathing was not just about physical oxygenation, but about maintaining mental calm, managing energy efficiently, and staying connected to the natural rhythms that governed all effective movement. "Tonight we'll work on pressure testing," Lee announced after they completed the warm-up exercises. Pressure testing was Lee's term for applying traditional principles under increasingly realistic conditions. It was one thing to redirect an opponent's energy during controlled practice, but quite another to maintain those same principles when facing serious intent to cause harm. Lee had a training partner join them for this session, an older man named Master Chang who had apparently been practicing traditional methods for most of his adult life. Chang was small and unassuming, the kind of person who would be completely unremarkable in a crowd. But Min-jun had learned not to judge traditional practitioners by their appearance. "Master Chang will attack you with genuine intent," Lee explained. "Your job is to maintain traditional principles regardless of the pressure you feel." The distinction was crucial. In most martial arts training, sparring was conducted with controlled techniques and mutual agreement about safety limits. What Lee was proposing was something closer to actual combat, or the attacker would hold nothing back in their attempts to overwhelm Minjun's defenses. Chang took a position across from Minjun and assumed what looked like a completely natural standing posture. There was nothing in his stance or bearing that suggested aggression or combative intent. But, when Li signaled the beginning of the exercise, Chang's transformation was immediate and shocking. The small, unassuming man exploded into motion with startling speed and intensity. His attacks came from angles Minjun hadn't anticipated, with timing that seemed designed to disrupt any defensive response. Most importantly, there was a quality of genuine threat that Minjun had rarely encountered in formal sparring. Ichan was attacking as if the outcome actually mattered. Minjun's initial responses were pure Taekwondo, reflexive defensive movements that had been drilled into him over years of training. But, as Li had predicted, those reactions felt crude and ineffective against Chang's unconventional attack patterns. The older man seemed to flow around Minjun's blocks and deflections like water around stones, finding gaps in his defense that shouldn't have existed. "Stop relying on techniques," Li called out during the exchange. "Techniques are what you do when you don't understand the situation." The advice sounded paradoxical to Minjun, whose entire martial arts background was built around mastering and applying specific techniques. But, as he tried to implement Li's instruction, he began to experience moments where his body seemed to respond naturally to Chang's attacks without conscious decision-making. Instead of choosing a specific block or evasion, Minjun found himself simply moving away from incoming attacks in whatever direction felt most natural. Rather than planning counterattacks, he discovered opportunities to gently redirect Chang's energy in directions that left the older man momentarily off balance. These moments were brief and inconsistent, but they represented something fundamentally different from anything Minjun had experienced in his previous martial arts training. There was a quality of effortless response that reminded him of Li's demonstrations, where techniques seemed to emerge naturally from understanding rather than being imposed through force of will. "Better," Li commented as they took a break. "You're beginning to trust your natural responses instead of overriding them with learned reactions." "It felt completely different," Minjun said, still trying to process what had happened. "Like the difference between speaking a foreign language you've memorized and speaking your native language naturally." "That's exactly right," Li confirmed. "Traditional methods are about rediscovering your natural fighting ability, not replacing it with artificial techniques." The concept was revolutionary for Minjun, whose entire martial arts career had been based on accumulating increasingly sophisticated techniques. The idea that effective fighting ability was something to be uncovered rather than constructed challenged his fundamental assumptions about learning and development. Master Chang joined their discussion during the break, speaking for the first time since Minjun had met him. "Young man shows good instincts," he said in heavily accented English. "Just need to trust them more than his training." Coming from someone who had just thoroughly tested Minjun's abilities, the compliment carried considerable weight. But Chang's assessment also highlighted the central challenge Minjun faced in his development. Years of Taekwondo training had created powerful habitual responses that often conflicted with the natural reactions that traditional methods sought to cultivate. "How do I learn to trust natural responses over trained ones?" Minjun asked. "Time and practice," Li replied. "And the willingness to fail while you're learning." They resumed training with increasingly challenging scenarios. Chang attacked with weapons, from multiple angles, and with combinations of techniques that stretched Minjun's ability to apply traditional principles under pressure. Each scenario revealed new gaps in his understanding while also providing opportunities to experience the effectiveness of natural response patterns. As the session progressed, Minjun began to notice something unexpected happening to his Taekwondo skills. Rather than simply abandoning his previous training, he found that certain techniques began to feel different when applied with traditional principles in mind. A simple front kick became more effective when he stopped trying to generate maximum power and instead focused on timing and positioning. Basic hand techniques worked better when he trusted his natural reactions rather than forcing predetermined movement patterns. "Traditional methods don't replace other martial arts," Li explained as they concluded the evening's training. "They provide the foundation that makes all martial arts more effective." This insight reframed Minjun's entire learning experience. He had been approaching traditional methods as a replacement for Taekwondo, when they might actually be a way of understanding what Taekwondo had been trying to accomplish all along. The difference was between learning techniques as isolated movements and understanding the principles that made those techniques effective in the first place. "I think I'm beginning to understand what you meant about becoming more yourself through martial arts," Minjun said as they prepared to leave the training hall. "How so?" "Taekwondo taught me to move like a Taekwondo practitioner," Minjun explained. "Traditional methods are teaching me to move like myself, but with better understanding of what effective movement actually means." Lee nodded approvingly. "That understanding will continue to deepen over time. What you've learned in 3 months is just the beginning." Walking home through the Seoul streets, Minjun reflected on how profoundly his life had changed since that first encounter with Lee at Changdeok Palace. What had begun as mild curiosity about an unresponsive guard had evolved into a complete re-evaluation of his approach to martial arts and, increasingly, to life in general. The traditional methods Lee taught weren't just about fighting, they were about learning to respond to any challenging situation with presence, awareness, and natural effectiveness. The principles that made combat techniques work also applied to teaching students, managing stress, and navigating the complexities of daily life. Over the following weeks, Minjun found himself applying traditional principles in his Taekwondo classes with remarkable results. Instead of simply teaching techniques, he began helping students understand the underlying concepts that made those techniques effective. Rather than demanding rigid adherence to formal movements, he encouraged students to find their own natural expression of Taekwondo principles. The changes were subtle but significant. Students who had plateaued in their development began making rapid progress. Advanced practitioners who had relied purely on physical ability started developing more sophisticated understanding of timing and positioning. Most importantly, everyone seemed to be enjoying their training more. "Master Kim, your teaching has really evolved lately," Sujin observed after one particularly productive class. "It's like you're helping us understand the why behind the techniques, not just the how." "Good teaching means helping students discover their own capabilities," Minjun replied, once again unconsciously echoing principles he had learned from Lee. 6 months after their first meeting, Minjun received an unexpected invitation. Lee asked him to return to Changdeok Palace for a special demonstration, not for tourists or dignitaries, but for a small group of traditional martial artists from various Asian countries who were gathering to exchange knowledge and preserve ancient teaching methods. "It's time for you to share what you've learned," Lee explained when they met at the palace. "Teaching others is the best way to deepen your own understanding." The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. Minjun had spent months learning to integrate traditional principles with his Taekwondo background, but he had never attempted to explain that integration to others. Teaching required a level of understanding that went beyond personal application. He would need to help others discover the same insights that had transformed his own practice. The gathering included masters of various traditional arts from China, Japan, Thailand, and other countries throughout Asia. These were serious practitioners who had devoted their lives to preserving ancient knowledge, and Minjun felt honored to be included in their company. When his turn came to demonstrate, Minjun chose to show how traditional principles could enhance conventional martial arts rather than replace them. He performed familiar Taekwondo techniques, but with the natural flow and adaptability he had learned from Lee. The result was martial arts that looked recognizably Korean but moved with an efficiency and grace that reflected deeper understanding. The response was immediate and positive. The gathered masters could recognize traditional principles regardless of their external expression, and they appreciated seeing ancient wisdom applied to modern martial arts. Several approached Minjun afterward to discuss how similar integration might be possible with their own arts. "You've become a bridge," Lee told him as the demonstration concluded. "Someone who can help others understand that traditional and modern martial arts don't have to be separate." That evening, as Minjun stood once again in the palace courtyard where everything had begun, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The confident Taekwondo master who had arrived here months ago seeking recognition had been transformed into something deeper and more complete, a martial artist who understood that true mastery meant continual learning and growth. Lee appeared beside him, no longer in his guard uniform but wearing the simple traditional clothes that Minjun had come to associate with their training sessions. "Are you still working as a palace guard?" Minjun asked, realizing he had never learned the full story of Li's situation. That was never really my job, Li replied with a slight smile. I volunteer here occasionally to help with cultural events and to meet people who might be ready for traditional teaching. The revelation recontextualized their entire relationship. Li hadn't been a guard who happened to know martial arts, he had been a traditional master using his position at the palace to identify potential students. Minjun's challenging behavior and obvious skill had marked him as someone who might be ready to learn deeper principles. So I was being evaluated from the moment we met? We're all being evaluated constantly, Li said. The question is whether we're paying attention to the lessons life is offering us. As they prepared to part ways, Minjun realized that while his formal training with Li might be ending, his real education was just beginning. He had been given tools and principles that would continue revealing new insights for years to come. More importantly, he had learned that mastery was not a destination but a way of traveling, an approach to continuous learning and growth that applied to martial arts and everything else in life. The young man who had struck out in frustration at an unresponsive guard had discovered something far more valuable than he could have imagined. In learning to yield rather than oppose, to flow rather than force, to trust natural wisdom rather than rely solely on accumulated technique, Minjun had found not just better martial arts but a better way of being in the world. And, in the quiet courtyard of an ancient palace, where centuries of Korean history continued to unfold, the cycle prepared to begin again with the next seeker ready to discover that sometimes the greatest strength comes from learning when not to fight at all.